The New Deal was a major turning point in the history of the United States because it marked the beginnings of governmental intervention in the economy. Many historians agree that there were many telltale signs that an event like the Great Depression was going to happen. After World War I, there was a sort of euphoria that swept through America, which could largely be attributed to nationalism. This euphoric feeling throughout the country led to the Roaring Twenties, which was a period of huge economic growth in America, where the stock market grew an enormous 667%. Businesses too felt this euphoria as they began to overproduce certain goods. This overproduction could be led to several different factors, such as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which in 3 years dropped American exports by almost 20%. Other factors were the introduction of credit and many Americans having less expendable income for smaller goods. One last factor in the excess of goods was the large separation of wealth between the rich and the poor. Roughly 6% of the population held over 30% of the wealth, which left less expendable income for the average American to purchase goods. All of these causes of the Great Depression and their extent were not fully realized until the symbolic beginning of the Great Depression, which is generally attributed to Black Tuesday, which occurred on October 29, 1929. The stock market took a drastic tailspin, and the Dow Jones dropped almost 23% in 2 days, which is a remarkable feat. People panicked and sold all their stocks, and there was an 89% decrease in stock prices. With the crash of the stock market, people began to realize how bad the American economy truly was. The president at the time was Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican. Hoover believed in non-intervention, and he felt that the economy should be left alone and it would right itself. Hoover remained steadfast in this position, and by the last year of his presidential term, unemployment had reached over 20%. 1 out of every 5 banks had failed, and millions were homeless, and even more people were looking for jobs. The depression that was now forming in America was now the biggest issue in the presidential election of 1932. In the presidential election of 1932, Hoover was the Republican candidate, while FDR was the Democratic candidate. FDR was promising change, while Hoover was remaining steadfast in his non-intervention opinion. FDR easily won, and followed through on the promises he had made when he was elected, sparking immediate change in America in the first 100 days of his presidency. These immediate changes became known as the New Deal for Americans. One of the first things FDR did when he took office was to shut down all of the banks. Banks were allowed to reopen after they had been assessed and were deemed solvent. FDR did not stop here, and through the rest of the first 100 days continued to implement different policies which created different organizations to try and help benefit the American people and the American economy. Some of the more famous organizations created were the FDIC, which ensured deposits made by Americans into banks, and the SEC, which helped to regulate the stock market. Both of these organizations still exist today, and their creation was the beginning of governmental intervention in the economy and regulation of the economy. After the first 100 days, FDR was certainly not done implementing changes. The first New Deal had not been as successful as he would have liked, and he felt that the answer to this was to implement even more changes with the second New Deal. The second New Deal lasted from 1934 to 1936, and was aimed less at reform of major industries and more on helping out the average American. 3 major accomplishments of the second New Deal were the WPA, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Social Security Act. The WPA sought to take millions of Americans and put them to work on public works projects such as building bridges and highways. The National Labor Relations Act encouraged union activity and collective bargaining between owners and union members. They created a National Labor Relations Board which oversaw this activity. The Social Security Act sought to provide care for the needy and elderly who had suffered greatly during the Great Depression. Up to 1940, massive amounts of legislation had been passed through by FDR and Congress with the 2 New Deals in an attempt to end the Great Depression and get the American economy moving again. While some of these legislations were partly successful, on the whole, they were pretty much a failure. FDR had exhausted almost every means possible to try and get the American economy going again, when an event happened that naturally got the economy going: World War II. The United States entered World War II in December of 1941. With the United States entry into the war, over 12 million Americans were sent into the military, and millions more were given defense-related jobs. These massive numbers took care of the staggering unemployment rates that were seen during the Great Depression. With the elimination of a lot of the unemployment, organizations from the New Deal, such as the WPA, were not needed and were accordingly terminated. FDR was the creator of a trend that is still followed in government today. This theme is intervention in issues of the economy. Prior to FDR, the government mostly left the private sector alone and did not intervene. Once the Great Depression happened, however, FDR changed all of this with his New Deal. He created organizations like the FDIC and SEC, which are still seen today and critical to the modern-day functions of the economy. Also, FDR established the trend that will be followed by the government today. This trend is, when there's a financial crisis, the government is now counted on to right the ship and fix the problems for the people. An example of this was the housing crisis and the stock market crash in 2008. When things got bad, America looked to the government. Obama responded with his bailout plan, which was very similar to a lot of the policies adopted by FDR in his New Deal. Lastly, the New Deal was a turning point because it established everything people know about government today. It was the turn from the small limited government to the more powerful government that intervened in more issues. It is common knowledge today that the government intervenes in almost everything, from making nutrition labels mandatory to false advertisements. All of this change can be attributed to one man and his plan, FDR and the New Deal.